The wind swept across the dry valley like a restless spirit, carrying dust, pine sap, and the faint crackle of distant campfires. That night the land felt watchful, as if the desert itself knew something had shifted. Riders had returned from a long journey, weary and silent, yet one figure sat apart from the rest, marked by the weight of leadership and by a stillness that came from years of battle, loss, and quiet restraint. He did not seek comfort nor company. His life had been shaped by warpaths, council fires, and long nights beneath the stars, where duty mattered more than desire. But on this night, fate placed someone in front of him who did not belong to the desert. It somehow seemed made for it. She was not from his people. Wrapped in a worn prairie shawl with dust on her boots and worry pressed into her face, she'd come to the camp by choice, not capture. Travelers whispered that she had walked through 2 towns, crossed open land alone, refused to turn back even when warned that the chief she sought rarely trusted strangers. Some said she carried news that could change the valley. Others said she sought protection. A few believed she was running from someone so dangerous that even the chief's warriors hesitated to ask why she was alone. Whatever the truth, she stood by the fire with a calm that unsettled the camp, as if she had already accepted whatever future the night would bring. He noticed that calm. The chief had faced men who carried rifles, settlers who spoke with broken promises, soldiers riding from distant forts, and even storms that tore through canyons without warning. Nothing shook him easily. Yet her quiet presence did. She did not tremble. She did not stare at the ground or watch him with fear. Instead, she looked at him as if trying to read something hidden, something more than a leader or warrior. That unspoken challenge stirred something he had long kept buried, something older than tradition and stronger than discipline. On any other night he would have turned away, but this time he could not. The elders watched with narrowed eyes, whispering about boundaries that should not be crossed. Some feared she would bring trouble. Others feared the chief himself would change. He had spent years guiding the tribe through uneasy times, guarding their land, earning respect through restraint, wisdom, and an iron sense of control. His presence kept enemies cautious and his people united. The idea that one outsider could unsettle him so deeply was enough to make even loyal warriors uneasy. She was offered food and a place to rest near the outer camp circle. But tradition required the chief to speak to guests personally. When he approached her, the firelight cast shadows on his face, highlighting the scars earned from battles that shaped his life. His voice, calm yet firm, asked who she was, where she came from, and why she crossed their land without fear. She answered simply that she had nowhere else to go, and that she sought a place where the truth mattered more than rumors. She spoke with neither pride nor desperation, only honesty. It was that honesty that unsettled him most, while others listened from the edges of the fire. He noticed the exhaustion beneath her steady voice. She had walked far, possibly without food or shelter. The desert night would soon turn cold. He knew she would not survive sleeping outside in her condition. And though he was known for discipline, he placed compassion above doubt. He offered her shelter in the old lodge that stood beside his own, a space used for honored guests. It was meant to be temporary, just for a night, until the council decided what to do with her. Yet when she tried to rest there, the wind tore at the hide walls and the cold crept through the seams. Eventually, she asked if she could sit by the central fire until dawn. Instead, told her she could rest inside his shelter, where the warmth held better. That choice changed everything. Inside, the quiet space felt different from the world outside. The chief kept his home simple, filled with tools, blankets, herbs, carved symbols, and items passed down from generations. She sat wrapped in a wool blanket near the fading embers while he prepared fresh firewood. The flames brightened slowly, bringing soft warmth and a glow that revealed how tired she truly was. She tried to stay awake out of respect, but exhaustion pulled at her eyes until she drifted into an uneasy sleep. He planned to step outside, giving distance and guarding the entrance as any leader would. Yet before he moved, she shifted in her sleep, holding the blanket closer as though the world had taken too much from her already. Something in that small motion stopped him. He had seen warriors fall, seen families torn apart, seen brothers turned against each other. But he rarely saw someone who carried strength and exhaustion at the same time. She looked like someone who had survived more than she admitted. That quiet resilience held him still. He sat by the fire instead of leaving, intending only to watch over her for the night. But as the hours passed, he found himself studying the faint lines of worry on her face, wondering what had driven her so far from the life she once knew. He tried to remind himself that this was just a guest, that dawn would end whatever this strange tension was. Still, his thoughts refused to settle. Each time she stirred or whispered something half-dreamed, he felt his guard slip piece by piece. The control he held through years of leadership began to loosen, replaced by curiosity, protectiveness, and a strange pull he could not explain. By midnight, he realized he had not left the fire. By the second hour, he stopped pretending he would. Something in that quiet shelter tied him to her presence in a way he could not break. The night passed slowly, each minute heavy with unspoken questions. Outside, the valley slept beneath a moon softened by clouds. Inside, two people who came from different worlds shared the same shelter, bound by silence rather than words. When dawn approached, a faint glow touched the horizon, and the chief finally looked away from her long enough to notice how long he had been awake. He had spent the whole night beside the fire, unable to leave. The warmth, the silence, the unknown truth she carried, all held him there in a way nothing ever had. He had lost control not through weakness, but through feeling something deeper than caution. It shook him because he did not understand it, as the first light spread across the sky. She woke slowly, eyes opening to see him still there, seated near the fire, watching, waiting, and trying to hide the storm behind his calm expression. She noticed the tired set of his shoulders, the way he had not slept either. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside did not exist. Before either could speak, voices echoed from outside the shelter. Riders had returned early, bringing news urgent enough to shake the morning calm. The chief stood, ready to face whatever awaited, but one question remained unspoken between them. Why had she really come? And what would happen when the truth finally surfaced? The riders' voices outside broke the quiet like stones dropped into still water. Hooves kicked dust near the main camp circle, and the sharp sound of reins snapping against saddles hinted that whoever returned had not come in ease. The chief stepped from the shelter, pulling the flap aside to face the pale morning light. The woman stayed inside, holding the blanket around her shoulders, listening without moving. She did not know whether to follow or stay hidden, so she remained silent, watching through a small seam in the hide wall. Outside, returning scouts spoke in terse tones as they dismounted. The chief's second in command, an older warrior with a stern jaw and steady eyes, pointed toward the northern ridge where the land curved toward a trading route used by settlers and drifters. Tracks had been found more than usual, heading toward the valley. Wagon wheels, boot prints, and the marks of draft animals suggested a group large enough to bring trouble. No one knew their intent, but the timing felt too close to be coincidence. The chief listened, without interrupting, his face unreadable. Though the woman could sense tension in the way the camp grew still, she stepped outside slowly. Careful not to draw attention, but eyes turned toward her anyway. Some of the warriors exchanged glances, wondering why she had emerged from the chief's private shelter rather than the guest lodge. She felt their silent questions settle like weight on her shoulders. She stood near the fire, not too close, hoping her presence wouldn't bring more suspicion. The chief glanced in her direction but said nothing. It was not time to address rumors. There were more urgent concerns. After the scouts finished their report, the chief asked for details in short, controlled questions. The group approaching was moving slow, carrying heavy gear. They might be settlers seeking land, traders passing through, or armed men tracking someone. No one could be sure. When one scout mentioned hearing raised voices on the wind during the night, a cold silence fell. It meant the group could be arguing or desperate, perhaps fleeing something or someone. A journey that tense rarely ended peacefully. The woman lowered her gaze. She knew groups like that. She had seen faces twisted by hunger and pride, Men who felt ownership over anything they laid eyes on, even people. She remembered a night when distant gunfire echoed across barren land, where she hid behind a broken fence while strangers shouted about who had rights to land they never farmed. She remembered running before sunrise, carrying nothing but a small pouch of keepsakes, and a decision that changed her future. She had promised herself never to return to that life. Yet trouble had followed her like a shadow. The chief ordered the scouts to rest and eat. When the crowd dispersed, he turned and walked toward her. She stood still, unsure whether he would ask her to explain herself or if he simply wanted to check on her well-being. His expression softened slightly, but his tone remained steady. He asked again why she came, though now his voice carried more weight, as if he suspected her past was connected to the approaching strangers. She hesitated. Choosing her words carefully, she explained that she had once lived near a quiet settlement that sat along a cattle route. It had been peaceful at first, full of families who wanted nothing but a place to work the soil and raise children. Over time, new men arrived, men who claimed ownership and made decisions without asking. They demanded land, livestock, and loyalty. When the townsfolk refused, threats replaced promises. She tried to stay invisible, but when a dispute turned violent, she witnessed something she should not have. Someone saw her hiding. After that, she knew she would not be safe, so she left before sunrise and kept walking until she reached the valley. He listened without interruption. She sensed that he believed her, but belief did not erase danger. If the men chasing her were the same ones near their land, they might bring conflict that would not stay outside the camp. She looked down at her boots, ashamed that her arrival might bring trouble. But he soon reminded her that no one stood alone here. People who reached his camp with honest intentions were under protection, and though he spoke those words with calm certainty, she could not help noticing how the other warriors listened carefully, weighing the risks. Later in the day, the camp settled into routine. Children carried water from the stream, women prepared hides for winter, and young riders tended to restless horses. The woman kept to the edge of the activity, helping where she could to earn trust. She stitched torn cloth for a mother with 3 young children, gathered dry branches for cooking fires, and fetched baskets of herbs someone dropped near the camp borders. She worked quietly, learning their customs through observation, not assumption. Yet even as she worked, she heard whispers. Some believed she sought refuge. Others suspected she carried secrets. A few wondered why the chief's eyes followed her more than others. The chief spent the afternoon speaking with elders and warriors, weighing options. They needed to know whether the strangers would pass or approach. Scouts prepared to ride again near sunset. Before they left, the chief glanced toward the riverbank, where the woman stood washing fabric. She did not look back, but he could feel the tension settling deeper between them. Not the kind that came from danger alone, but the kind that formed when 2 paths crossed without warning, and neither person knew what would happen next. As evening approached, the camp gathered for supper. Smoke curled from cooking pits, filling the air with the scent of herbs and roasted meat. The woman sat alone near a smaller fire rather than join the main circle, wanting to avoid calling attention to herself. She ate quietly, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. Stars began to appear, scattered across the widening sky. The night was calmer than the one before, but the quiet held something heavy beneath it, like a held breath. Later, she wandered toward the stream to rinse her hands. The moon reflected off the water, turning the river's surface silver. The night insects hummed softly, and the cool breeze brushed against her face. She closed her eyes, wishing for a moment of peace. But footsteps approached behind her, slow and deliberate. She turned to see the chief standing a short distance away, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. He studied her for a moment before speaking, asking again not what she fled from, but what she hoped to find here. She struggled to answer. She did not come seeking power, wealth, or admiration. She had no land to claim, no title, no promise to fulfill. She simply wanted a life where she could breathe without fear, where she was not judged by who she belonged to or what someone wanted from her. She told him she wanted a place where trust meant something. He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. Leaders carried burdens unseen by others. Perhaps he feared that trusting her would change more than he was ready to face. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a faint echo across the valley. Horses in the distance. Not many, but enough to matter. The chief turned sharply, listening. She felt her heart sink. The riders had returned from the ridge sooner than expected, and their return had not brought ease. The chief moved toward the camp center, calling for watch posts and signal fires. The quiet evening turned tense as shadows moved across the hills. The woman stepped back, afraid that the past she tried to escape had finally found her, as torches lit the edge of the camp. The chief took one last look at her. His voice was low but steady when he spoke. If those riders came for her, the camp would be drawn into a conflict they did not choose. She felt shame rise in her throat, but before she could apologize, he stopped her with a raised hand. He told her that no one owns the land, no one owns another person, no one would be handed over to strangers without proof or justice. His words carried a calm strength that steadied her breathing. But the storm in the distance kept growing. Hooves thundered again. Closer this time, and the warriors moved to guard the camp. The night that began in quiet reflection now swelled with danger. The woman stood gripping the edge of her shawl, watching as firelight shimmered against drawn weapons. She did not know whether these men were trackers, traitors, or enemies. She only knew she could not run again. The chief stepped toward the front ranks, shoulders squared, ready to confront whatever approached. The air felt charged, as if the land itself waited to see what choice would be made. And somewhere beyond the dark ridge, voices rose, carrying through the wind, searching for someone they refused to lose. The sound of hooves rolled across the valley like a distant storm, steady at first, then growing louder as the riders approached. Fires burned brighter near the camp's edge, casting long shadows across the ground. The chief moved with calm calculation, directing warriors to take positions along the natural ridges and brush lines. They stood ready, not hostile, but prepared to protect what was theirs. The woman watched from behind a cluster of cedar trees, her fingers twisting the edges of her shawl. She felt the weight of every choice that had brought her here, wondering if she had led danger straight to people who had shown her nothing but cautious kindness. The first figures emerged through the dark, carrying lanterns that flickered against the wind. Their horses were tired and dust-covered, yet the men rode with stubborn intent. They halted just before reaching the campfire glow, refusing to cross into Apache land without invitation. The chief stepped forward alone, chin raised, voice firm and steady as he demanded to know their purpose. The lead rider lifted his hat, revealing a hardened face carved by the sun and travel. He claimed they were looking for a missing woman, someone who had left their settlement without warning. He spoke of her as though she belonged to them, as if she were property that had been misplaced. The chief's jaw tightened at the man's tone. Around them, camp torches crackled, each flame swaying with the tension between both sides. The woman stayed hidden, but she could hear their words clearly. The lead man mentioned her by description, not name. Worn boots, faded shawl, a small scar near the temple. The details matched her perfectly. He did not speak with concern or grief. He spoke with ownership and irritation, as if losing her had damaged his pride more than anything else. Another rider chimed in bitterly, saying she ran off with information she had no right to hear. They made it sound like she had defied some rule they believed was carved in stone. The woman's chest tightened. She knew that if she stepped forward now, she would be dragged back into the same life she fought to escape. The chief listened, eyes narrowing. He asked why they believed she had stolen anything. Their answer was vague, filled with half-truths and anger. They claimed she overheard talk about land rights and a planned expansion to seize a stretch of river territory. But their story drifted, lacking consistency. One said she spied, another said she was simply in the wrong place. The chief recognized the cracks in their tale. They were not here for justice. They were here for control. Before he could speak further, one of the Apache scouts rode in from behind the camp, whispering that more riders waited beyond the ridge. Not just 3 or 4, but enough to raise questions. If they wanted a peaceful conversation, they would have brought fewer men. The chief's patience thinned, and his tone became sharper. He told the riders that no one would be handed over. They had no authority here. If they wished to continue through the valley safely, they must travel with respect. The men bristled. One reached for his saddlebag as though searching for a letter or proof, but his hand moved too close to his holster. Several Apache bows rose instinctively. The chief raised his hand to hold them back. No blood would spill unless necessary. The men, realizing they were outnumbered, decided to withdraw and return at sunrise with their full party. As they turned their horses, their leader gave a hard glare toward the camp, promising they would return for what was theirs. When the last hoofbeat faded, the chief walked quietly toward the cedar trees where he knew she hid. She stepped out before he spoke, her face pale in the firelight. She tried to explain herself again, insisting she never stole anything. She simply heard men arguing about land they never earned, men planning to push out small families who work the soil. She had tried to warn townsfolk, but by sunrise, she was the one forced out. The chief believed her, but belief did not erase the problem. Her past had arrived with armed men who held more pride than reason. He told her the valley would not turn her away, but she must understand that her presence now tied her fate to theirs. She nodded, though fear still flickered beneath her calm expression. Later that night, the council met near the central fire. Elders, warriors, mothers, and young men gathered in a tight circle. The woman stayed at a distance, watching as voices rose and fell in debate. Some wanted to move her deeper into the mountains, away from danger. Others argued that sending her off alone would show weakness. A few worried the approaching men might bring soldiers if turned away again. The chief remained silent until every voice had been heard. He finally spoke with a steady tone that silenced the group. He reminded them that land claimed through fear never stayed peaceful. If their valley was strong, it must stand strong for those who sought refuge, not just those born beneath its soil. His words struck deep, though some remained unsure. The decision was made to wait until sunrise when the riders returned. No action would be taken until motives became clear. As campfires burned low, the night stretched long. She was given a place to rest, though she found little sleep. She lay awake listening to distant coyotes and the soft murmur of watchmen guarding the perimeter. Each sound made her wonder what morning would bring. Would these people defend her once blades were drawn? Would she be forced to leave so others would not suffer? Just before dawn, the chief came to check the guard posts. His steps slowed near her shelter. She rose, meeting his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Something unspoken hung between them, a connection deeper than fear or gratitude. She told him she did not want to be the cause of war. He answered that war begins long before the first strike. It begins in the minds of men who believe they deserve power. The valley had seen such men before. They would not bow now, when morning finally broke. Dew clung to dry grasses, and the horizon glowed faintly red, a warning of heat and tension ahead. The returning riders formed a long line that stretched across the ridge, double the number from the night before. They carried rifles, not just lanterns. Their leader rode forward, this time without hesitation. Demanding the woman be handed over, the chief stood his ground, flanked by warriors who held spears and bows with unshaking resolve. He gave the riders one chance to turn back. They refused. Voices rose, threats formed, hands drifted toward weapons. The valley air thickened, charged with danger. The woman stepped forward slightly, though not enough to be seen as surrendering. She could see some faces she recognized, men who once called themselves protectors of the settlement, now looking at her like she was a problem to erase. They shouted accusations, calling her a liar, a deserter, someone who betrayed people who fed her. Her chest tightened. She wanted to shout back, but fear locked her voice. The chief finally spoke with a force that cut through the noise. He said no person would be claimed like cattle. If the riders sought land, they would not find it here. If they sought her, they must bring truth, not threats. But the riders did not come to talk. They wanted power, and they expected fear to open the path. Hands tightened around reins and rifle grips. The warriors shifted into defensive stances. The earth grew silent. Listening, no one fired. Not yet. But one wrong word could tear the moment apart. Before violence erupted, a new figure rode from the back of the group. He looked different from the others. younger, sharper, dressed in a long coat sewn from city fabric rather than trail-worn leather. He held a small document sealed in wax. He claimed to speak on behalf of a land syndicate buying property across the region. He insisted that the woman carried knowledge of deals not yet public and that her silence posed a threat to their plans. He offered money, supplies, and safe passage if she was turned over quietly. His smooth tone was dangerous. It was more polished than the angry voices around him. The chief studied him, sensing that this man was not driven by personal pride but by something larger, something planned. The woman felt her stomach twist. She knew now that leaving the settlement had not just angered a few men. It had disrupted a growing scheme to seize land across the frontier. She was not simply running from trouble. She was standing in the doorway of a larger storm. The riders waited for an answer. The chief held their gaze, unshaken, refusing both bribe and threat. The young man's smile faded. He turned his horse without another word, signaling the others to withdraw for now. The conflict was not finished. It had only stepped back to gather strength. As they rode away, dust rose behind them like smoke. The woman exhaled shakily, gripping her shawl. The chief watched the horizon, knowing peace had only been borrowed for a moment. The valley stood quiet again. But every heart knew the storm would return, stronger, sharper, and unwilling to walk away a second time. And somewhere deep inside that silence, a choice waited to be made. One that could bind their futures together or break them apart forever. The dust had barely settled before the valley shifted into a different rhythm. Scouts rode out before sunrise each day, shadowing the ridges and canyon paths to track the movements of the riders who claimed they would be back. Women packed dried meat, herbs, and water in case the camp needed to relocate quickly. Warriors sharpened arrowheads, repaired bowstrings, and reinforced watch points along the river bend. Even children sensed the change, playing quieter, staying closer to their families, listening more than they spoke. The calm life of the valley no longer felt untouched. It felt alert, bracing. The woman tried to help where she could, though she carried guilt like a weight across her chest. She knew that if she had stayed silent in the settlement, this conflict would not have followed her. Yet she also knew that silence would have cost others their homes and land. She found herself torn between regret and resolve. Every time she saw the chief speak with elders or send scouts into the night, she felt her heart twist. She did not want him to bear consequences for choices. She made far from this place. He sensed her burdens even when she tried to hide them. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the mountains, she sat alone near the stream, washing her hands. The chief approached quietly, his stride steady, the sound of his steps blending with the rustle of water and grass. He did not speak at first, simply stood beside her, watching the faint moon reflect off the surface. Finally, he told her that burdens are not always wrong. Some burdens come from doing what is right. She listened without arguing because part of her wanted to believe that. Still, fear lingered. In the days that followed, tension grew, not only from approaching danger, but from inside the camp. Some of the younger warriors questioned why she remained so close to the chief. They whispered that she brought distraction, that his focus might be shifting at a time when clarity mattered most. Their words never rose to open disrespect, but the undercurrent was there. Loyalty demanded discipline, and new emotions could cloud judgment. The chief ignored such whispers, yet he was not immune to the pressure. His people came first. He had never strayed from that duty. But there were quiet moments. Often late at night, when he walked past her shelter and paused, just long enough to sense her presence. And there were moments when she looked toward the central fire and found his gaze already there. Neither spoke of it, but both understood something between them was changing. Shaped not by desire alone, but by hardship shared, the conflict outside camp sharpened when a scout returned breathless, claiming he saw campfires along the canyon trail. Not one or two, but many, stretching like beads of flame across the dark ridge. The riders had gathered reinforcements. They were not simply searching now. They were preparing. Their growing camp sat close enough to watch the valley, but far enough to strike when ready. This was no longer a dispute over a lost traveler. It was a standoff over land and power. The chief called for a council that night, larger than any before. Firelight marked every face with shifting shadows. The woman stood apart, watching elders speak with slow patience, while warriors argued in heated tones. Some demanded a preemptive strike, believing surprise was their advantage. Others urged diplomacy, hoping the riders could still be reasoned with. A few suggested relocating temporarily, letting the riders settle their frustrations and leave. No choice seemed simple. The chief listened to every voice, sitting near the flames with his hands resting over his knees. When silence finally settled, he said that war was not chosen by those who defend their home. It was chosen by those who try to take it. They would not attack first, but they would not leave. The valley was more than a place to sleep. It held graves, memories, paths carved by ancestors. Leaving without cause would be surrender. After the council ended, he walked away from the fire, needing quiet. She followed at a distance, footsteps soft on dry soil. When he finally stopped, she stood beside him, not too close, but close enough to speak without raising her voice. She told him she would leave if it meant peace for his people. She would rather walk alone than become the reason blood stained the valley. She meant every word. He turned to her with a steady gaze, the fire reflecting faintly in his eyes. He said leaving would not end this conflict. If the riders won here, they would take from others next. The valley was simply the first step in a path carved by greed. She realized then that the trouble she fled was not isolated. It was growing across the frontier. Reaching further each season, their conversation broke when a cry echoed from the far end of camp. One of the night guards had returned wounded. A gash across his arm and dust clinging to his hair told the story before he spoke. He had been watching the ridge when a group of armed men attempted to circle behind the camp. He escaped only because they did not expect him to move so fast. The chief helped steady him, calling for herbs and bandages. The injured guard claimed the men were setting markers, preparing a path for a larger attack. This news changed everything. Warriors sprang into motion, grabbing weapons and mounting horses. The camp trembled with activity. The woman stepped forward, insisting she help tend the wounded, her hands moving with calm focus, even though her heart raced. She worked beside the healers, grinding herbs and tying cloth, grateful for something useful to do. Later, when quiet returned, she noticed the chief standing alone near the ridge. Staring into the vast dark where trouble gathered, she approached, hesitant. He spoke first, saying they could not wait much longer. If the riders chose violence, the valley had to be ready. The next day, preparations turned urgent. Defensive lines were set along narrow passes where the land naturally funneled riders. Scouts memorized canyon paths that offered cover. Hunters brought extra supplies in case the camp needed to hold out for days. Still, the tension rising had another layer beneath it, one neither the chief nor the woman dared acknowledge openly. The unspoken bond between them grew stronger, sharpened by danger, deepened by trust built in silence. But neither allowed it to cloud the decisions ahead. As sunset neared once more, another scout returned with news that struck deeper than the others. The riders had split into two groups. One remained visible along the ridge, while a second group traveled through the low country, hidden by brush and tall grass. They were planning to surround the valley. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Soon. That night, the chief gathered only his most trusted warriors for a private council. The woman did not belong in that circle, yet she lingered nearby, listening to faint voices as flames flickered. Plans were made to intercept the hidden group before they reached the valley center. It would require moving out under cover of darkness, taking the fight away from families and children. When the council ended and the group dispersed, the chief approached her once more, the firelight dim on his face. He told her she should stay in the inner circle of camp where it was safest. She shook her head. She said she would rather face danger beside those who protected her than hide behind them. He studied her a long moment, as if memorizing the resolve in her eyes. Finally, he nodded. When midnight came, the camp lay quiet except for the spacing of sentries and the rustle of wind across tall grass. The chief rode toward the canyon with a group of warriors, moving silently, guided by moonlight and instinct. The woman followed on foot with others trailing behind, prepared to tend the wounded if needed. Each step carried the faint thrill of courage and the sharp taste of fear as they neared the low country. The moon slipped behind clouds, plunging the ridge into shadow. The chief raised his hand. Everyone stopped. In the silence, distant metal clinked, followed by muffled voices. The hidden riders were close, aware they were moments away from confrontation. Warriors tightened their grips on spears and bows. The chief stepped forward, ready to command the first move. Behind him, the woman watched, breath held, knowing the moment ahead would change everything. No matter what happened next, no one would return from this night unchanged. The valley waited, heavy with the weight of what was coming, the last calm before the clash that could break the land or save it. The woman's heartbeat matched the rhythm of distant hooves, each second drawing them closer to the point of no return, where choices hardened into fate. And just as the riders crested the final rise, the chief whispered for his warriors to ready themselves. The world narrowing to the space between drawn breath and battle, the moon slipped out. From behind the clouds at the worst time, spilling pale light across the ridge where both groups finally came face to face. The hidden riders froze for a heartbeat, realizing they had been discovered, their plan no longer secret. The chief stepped forward, standing between his warriors and the approaching men. His posture calm yet solid, like someone rooted into the land itself. He raised his voice, not in anger, but in warning. He told them that no one would be forced from this land, and no one would be claimed as property. His words echoed across the valley floor, steady and unshaken. The riders hesitated, lowering reins and shifting in their saddles. They did not expect resistance so far from camp. The younger leader in the long coat nudged his horse forward, speaking as though he still held all power. He claimed the valley belonged to the syndicate now, that deals had already been made. But the chief answered that land is not bought with fear, and that no treaty existed with people who never earned the right to claim it. The woman stepped beside him then, her presence quiet but firm. She admitted openly that she had overheard their plans, not to steal information, but because she refused to stand silent when innocent families were at risk. Some riders shouted back, calling her a traitor. Others looked uneasy, as if only now realizing they had been following men driven by greed rather than justice. The tension broke when one older rider spoke up, saying he had never agreed to take land that was already lived on and tended. His words shook the group more than any threat could have. The young leader snapped at him, revealing that he had been using the riders as leverage to push a larger expansion, not to bring order or protection like he once promised them. That moment of truth cracked their unity, while they argued among themselves. The chief moved closer, voice steady but sharper, telling the men they had a choice. They could return home and live by honest work, or they could push forward and face consequences that would stain their futures. His words were not threats. They were truths spoken by someone who understood how battles haunt the land long after men walk away. Slowly, weapons lowered. Some men turned their horses without another word and rode back toward the ridge, ashamed or disillusioned. A few remained loyal to the young leader, but even they seemed shaken by doubt. The leader pulled at his reins, face twisted in anger, refusing to accept defeat. He raised his rifle, not at the chief, but at the woman. That single motion shifted everything. Before he could fire, an arrow struck the ground near his horse's hooves, shot by one of the chief's warriors with flawless aim. The horse reared, forcing the leader to drop the rifle to steady himself, with his advantage gone. He found himself alone at the front of a crowd that no longer supported him. He realized he could not force his will tonight. Without power backing him, he turned away, spitting bitter words that he would return with papers and soldiers next time, not riders. But his threats rang hollow now that everyone had seen his true intent. One by one, the men rode away, the young leader's anger fading into the distance like dust swallowed by darkness. Silence followed, heavy but relieved. The chief released the breath he had held, and the warriors slowly eased their grips on weapons. The woman stood beside him, still trembling from how close danger had come, yet grounded by the knowledge that the truth had finally been spoken in the open. She watched the riders disappear beyond the hills, hoping they chose a different path from now on. When they returned to the valley, dawn was rising. Families emerged from their shelters, waiting anxiously for news. The chief told them the threat had passed for now, but they would continue preparing in case the future brought new storms. The camp let out a collective breath, children running back to riverbanks, elders tending fire pits, life flowing again in gentle rhythm. The woman helped tend the wounded guard who had been struck days earlier, her hands steady now that her heart finally knew peace. In the following days, the valley healed from fear. Scouts continued watching the ridges, but no riders returned. Word spread across nearby settlements that the syndicate had lost support among its own people, weakening its plans. A few families even traveled toward the valley seeking honest trade rather than control. The land became quieter again, but now held a deeper strength, marked by what it had survived. The woman stayed. No longer as a wanderer or someone hiding from the past, but as someone choosing to belong. She began learning the tribe's ways, helping with hides, gathering plants, and sharing small skills of her own from her old life. She laughed more, slept easier, and found purpose not because she needed protection, but because she wanted to build something worth staying for. The chief kept his distance at first, wary of blurring duty with personal feeling. But there were evenings when he sat near the riverbank at sunset, and she joined him without needing an invitation. Words were not always needed. They shared quiet moments, watching the light fade across the water, knowing both had changed because of the other. He admired her courage, not just in facing danger, but in choosing to stay when leaving was easier. She admired his strength, not just in battle, but in leading with restraint and compassion. One night, as the fire crackled low and stars filled the sky, she asked what would happen if trouble returned someday. He answered that no land, no life worth having, was ever free of storms. But this time she would not face them alone. He said it calmly, but the weight of those words settled deep in her heart. Life in the valley continued. The camp expanded gardens near the river. Hunters brought back fresh game. Children grew, elders taught stories, and horses grazed under wide blue skies. She became part of that world, not as a guest, but as family. Seasons passed and the young leader never returned. Rumors said he left the region entirely after losing support. Others claimed he tried to push his plans elsewhere but failed. Whatever the truth, his shadow no longer touched the valley. The chief and the woman stood together as each season changed, guiding others, shaping decisions, and sharing a bond rooted in trust rather than ownership. No grand declaration was needed. Their connection grew in quiet acts, shared burdens, and unspoken loyalty. The first night they met had been full of uncertainty. Now, when dawn came, they faced it side by side. She found peace not because she was hidden from the world, but because she finally belonged to a life that honored truth and strength. He found something he had never expected. Not a distraction from duty, but a reason to look ahead rather than back. The valley remained protected, not by force alone, but by unity. Their story became one told around fires, not as a tale of battle, but as a story of finding a place to stand when the world tries to push you down. A story of a woman who refused to be owned, and a leader who refused to let power overwrite compassion. A story of the night a man known for control lost it to something deeper, and how that changed everything for the better. The land breathed easier. The people grew stronger. And the valley remained a place where courage and gentleness could live side by side, protected by those who understood both. The story ended not with a quiet departure, but with a lasting peace built by two people who chose each other and the land that brought them together.